never managed to be able to do this because I scroll all over. But the more detailed and the better your notebook is, the easier it's going to be to come back and be able to reconstruct this. And see, a methodology is something that you did, so you're intimately engaged with it. It's also straight process, right? I mean, it's straight. Here, this was the first thing we did, here's the second thing we did, here's the third thing we did, here's the fourth thing we did, here's the fifth thing we did. It's not that mechanical. But, you know, it's straight process, right? You're detailing the steps that you took to conduct this research. And that's an easy thing from both the writer and the reader's perspective. For some reason, the human brain does really well with process because it's just, you know, very straightforward. And so it's easy for you to write. It's something you know. It's an easy writing pattern. And it's also easy for the reader to read. You've got ready-made transitions. First, second, third, next, consecutively, subsequently, after 3 days, right? You've got some real nice ready-made transitions that you can use as you move from thought to thought. So, you know, it's easy for you to write, it's easy for me to read, and when you do that, boy, you've got a big chunk of this done already. You've accomplished something, and you haven't had to really stare at a blank sheet of paper or a blank computer screen for very long. Now, and if you've got this part done, you know, you've already got, what, a quarter of this, a fifth of this done, you might as well go ahead and finish the rest of it, right? I mean, it's real easy at the introduction to say, oh my gosh, I can't do this at all, and go to the movies, or go out with your friends, right? Or just in frustration throw your computer against the wall. But you know, once you get like a fourth or a fifth of this done, you're thinking, well, okay, I've got this part done, I might as well finish it because I'm into this now, right? This is the next easiest thing to write, is your results. Again, it's something that you are intimately aware of, so you know it. It's also pretty straightforward. You make all these cute graphic aids, you know, tables and charts, and you get schematics, and some of these are actually generated by whatever devices or a computer that you're using, so you don't have to do them by yourself. And I mean, some of them are really kind of attractive, right? Personally, I really think some of these graphic aids and schematics that scientists come up with are really art. You could actually frame them and hang them on the wall because they can be very attractive. So, you know, you can gotta get those done. And then what you've got to come up with is what you were saying. You can't just let them stand alone, but you've got to come up with the introduction to them so I know what it is I'm looking at, and then you've got to say what I'm supposed to see from it. But, you know, that's also fairly, fairly easy to do, right? Because you know what these things are and what they're supposed to be doing. So, you know, these two things are, you know, not all that bad. I mean, considering writing. I mean, writing is sweating blood. There's no getting around it. Don't let anybody tell you anything different. But, you know, these are two of the very easiest, most straightforward things that you can do. That's where I would start. Because now you've got almost half of this done, right? And you've got the big part of this, all of the brand new research that, you know, has got to get out there and get to be published. So, you know, once you get those two done, then you can go back and start thinking about how do I introduce this, and then how do I finish this up. Now, if you work with, like, say, me, like Diane is, this is probably the time where we will spend most of our time, because this is very difficult to do. Writing the introduction and the literature review requires so much time together of all kinds of different thoughts, all kinds of different pieces of research, all kinds of different conclusions, all kinds of different implications, and getting the focus and the emphasis correct. It's all about focus and emphasis for the topic and the purpose and the audience. And you don't have to tell me how hard this is. I mean, I know. It is excruciatingly difficult because, for a couple of reasons, especially as a beginning researcher. This part, like I said, quite often you think about it as just kind of being your literature review because it's what's setting up the whole context for whatever research is that you are writing. Part of the issue is that sometimes there are names that are so important and significant to the field, they're so fundamental, that no matter what you're writing, you have to mention them, right? I mean, there are people that, if it's not in there, they're going to wonder if you actually did all of the background work that you needed to do to be believable. Sometimes what those people did is kind of tangential to what you've done. And figuring out how to get them in is very difficult, even though you know it has to be there. So that's one reason why it's difficult. And if you're writing, say, a thesis and a dissertation, much harder to do a literature review than it is for a journal article, because a journal article is much shorter. You only have X number of pages, right? Nobody's going to let you write 525 pages for a journal article. You'd have to own the publishing company yourself if you were going to be able to do that. But you know, a thesis or a dissertation, this whole introduction and literature review thing is going to be a chapter or two, right? It's going to be a large body of work here. And part of what it has to show is that you know enough about the area that I can believe what you have done. So part of what this does is it also establishes your credibility as a professional and as a researcher in this topic. And trying to do that, especially with a thesis or a dissertation, there is a lot of background material that you have to cover in order to prove that to your committee. In a journal article, you still have to do the same proof, but usually it's by far more abbreviated. But yes, so that's another reason that makes this difficult, is you've got to be able to do that and to be able to fit your topic and your purpose and your audience and know what's important and what kind of focus and emphasis you need to set up this context for yourself. And on top of that, you have to tell the story. There's a big temptation to write a bibliographic essay at this point. Do y'all know what that is? Y'all know what a bibliography is, right? Or a works cited page. Do you know what an annotated bibliography is? Yes? All right. Well, a bibliographic essay then is the next step. You know, a bibliography or a works cited is just a straight listing, right? All you give is the author, title, publication data. An annotated bibliography puts in 2 or 3 sentences about what it was about, right? Well, a bibliographic essay takes that annotation and it creates paragraphs so that you've got an essay that covers this bibliography rather than just a couple, 2, 3 sentences. If I look down a literature review and an introduction, and every single paragraph, or most paragraphs, start with author and title, you've got a bibliographic essay. Because all you've done then is essentially abstract different pieces of literature, rather than write a literature review. The operative word here is review. And that's the hard part. And this is why I started this whole discussion here about this structure with the idea of chronology. Because usually, now this is usually, this depends a bit. Usually this literature review is done in chronological order. You start with the earliest piece of research and you work your way down to the most current. Well, because that's where you're going to step in, right? So you start with the earliest because what you're doing here is you're tracing the research conversation. You aren't the first person who has stepped in to conduct research in this area. Remember, we've started up here with this phenomenon, this context. You're not the first person that has conducted research here. There's this research conversation that's going on, and it has been going on, and now all of a sudden, for as long as you're involved, you're going to enter into this. And then this research conversation is going to continue after you. So you are situating yourself within this conversation so that the audience knows and the profession knows where you fit in. So that's the purpose of this literature review, is to set up what conversation you're joining and where you are placing yourself within that conversation. And so you do that by doing it chronologically. And believe me, it's very easy. I mean, it's much easier I can't say very easy because it's still very difficult. But if you stop and think about it that way, that you're tracing this research conversation, it helps you get a handle on what it is you're doing. It also helps you start this paper. One thing I think about writing professionally is, compared to writing an interpretive essay about a piece of literature or a research paper on any topic, I think there's a lot more cut and dried strategies that you can use to at least get yourself started. Telling you how to write a research paper on any topic or a research essay, all of that is much more nebulous than it is to actually write a journal article. Because I can say, what is the area that you're talking about? Are you talking about growing stem cells? Are you talking about robots? Are you talking about haptic robots? Are you talking about social media? What's the phenomenon that started this? Well, and then what's the research that's been conducted on this? And if you start with the first piece, there was a reason for this first piece. That's why you've got your context, right? Does that make sense? All right. Now, the second guy who conducted research, and I'm using guy here to mean everybody, second gal who conducted this, they knew the first one, right? Research is not conducted in a vacuum, right? It's shared, right? And everybody's had to write a literature review, right? So, the second person knew what the first person did, and there's a reason why that was the second study. That's what you're tracing, is they changed some parameter, the temperature, the time, the length of the wire, the intensity of the current, the size of the sample, the type of the sample. This one was done. Well, now let's try and see what would happen if we did this. And then the third person comes along and knows the first two. And what did they add? What did that person add to the conversation? What parameter did they change? What different tangent did they kind of go off on? That's how you tie this together, is you take a look at the first piece and you say, all right, this is how the second one fits with the first one. This is how the third one fits in with those two. Here's how the fourth one fits in. That's the story, right? Those are your transitions. I'm assuming you've all heard the word transition, right? That's how you move from one piece of research to the next. And that's what gets you beyond it being a bibliographic essay, because you're actually telling the story, creating the conversation that you're using. And like I said, review here is the operative word. If you're writing an abstract, you've got to put everything in, right? I mean, an abstract is a specific, I hate to use the word summary, because you and I define summary very differently, but it's a specific summary of what this research is or was. And I mean, journals are going to tell you how long they can be, but if you're writing one for yourself, you want to be very complete. Because the more general you are, the less you know what that piece of research did, what the results were, what the methodology was. And so when you're writing an abstract, you have to put everything in and you have to be objective. You can't add editorial comments like this was the stupidest methodology I've ever seen. It was very carelessly done. They ignored this, and this. That is not in an abstract, right? And you're careful even in the literature review, especially as a new researcher. You don't want to, as a new researcher, to write, they were the stupidest researchers I've ever seen. You take those kinds of issues and you work it more toward what work still needs to be done in the field, right? Rather than criticizing somebody who probably has more education and experience than you do. And so that becomes the focus of it. But in a literature review, you can pick and choose what you want to emphasize and focus on, because you're aiming toward where you fit in. When you tie all of this together, when you get down to the last piece in this, you're going to say something like, while we know A, B, and C, we still don't know X. It's important to know X because. And after you say that, you usually say something about, so the overall research idea here was this. Specifically, it addressed these particular areas. And then you get methodology as your heading. All right, see how that is very chronological. There is no stopping there to say, all right, so let me sum up what I've said in the past about all of these studies, right? It was strictly, here is what the phenomenon is. Here's what the first research did in order to address it. Here's how the second fit in. Here's how the third fit in. Here's how the fourth fit in. The closest you have come to a summary is to say, while we know A, B, and C, we still don't know this. I mean, look at how short that is. Because what happens is people start backing up. Remember I said you keep moving forward, right?